Hello, can you hear me? Is that on? Is it on? Hello everybody, thank you very much for coming. Good afternoon. I realise the competition is Charlie Brooker's Alternative McTaggart, so I'm very flattered.
Tell them that, they'll all leave.
Yeah, we should notice. We should feel very flattered that you've come to join us. The name of the session this afternoon is Docs on the Box, Alive and Kicking. And I'm not sure whether it was a typo or not, but I don't think it was ever decided whether that should be a question mark or a statement. So whether they are alive and kicking. I think that the truth seems to be that documentaries on terrestrial television are in rude health. There's 250 hours of them on the BBC on all the channels. There's 50 to 60 hours on 5 this year. There's approximately 120 on Channel 4 and 60 on More 4. And ITV's press office tell me that there's 200 on ITV, which I don't think can be quite right. I think that must be a quite elastic definition of documentary. But the point really is that there's a lot of it on, and a lot of it's really, really fantastic, and a lot of it's doing really, really well. So I thought it'd be a really good idea to invite a few practitioners and one commissioner, ex-practitioner, along to have a look at some of the different trends, talk about some clips that I think show some interesting directions that people are following at the moment. And just to paraphrase Mark Twain, I think perhaps reports of the death of documentary, we hear that every year at this festival and at Sheffield. I think they've been greatly exaggerated, and hopefully we can talk about that a bit more today. Joining me, first up, ladies first, is Emma Cooper, who is a commissioning editor for documentaries at Channel 4. She's an ex-BBC producer who I guess really made her name working with Louis Theroux. They spent time together in prison, hanging out with paedophiles, and now she's working at Channel 4.
Yeah.
Doing much the same thing. Doing much the same thing, exactly. Yeah. And looking after Cutting Edge, primarily. Yeah. Andy McKenzie's the creative director of 2-4. He's a poacher turned gamekeeper turned super poacher, I think you could say. He's been the producer and a commissioning editor. Notably at 2-4's show that we were talking about this morning, another session was the brilliant Educating Essex. But Andy has also been a commissioner and commissioned the original Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, Boys and Girls Alone, which I think was a sort of forerunner of some of the ideas that have developed with Riggs, and Wank Week at Channel 4.
Masturbator song that never made it to
That's the one that got away.
Yeah, lest we forget. It wasn't a Riggs show though, was it, Wank Week? Maybe it should have been. That might have...
Well, maybe there is an idea in that, isn't
there? There is actually, yeah, we'll talk about it afterwards. Bryan Woods runs True Vision and has a veteran of all sorts of different amazing documentaries, most of which tend to centre around human rights and social justice. His hobbies include collecting awards, lots of awards, for films like Dying Rooms, Zimbabwe's Lost Children, The Children of Gaza, and the list goes on and on. And finally, Magnus Temple is the founder and head gardener at one of UK's hottest production companies, The Garden. Their big show at the moment is 24 Hours in A&E, which is currently in its second series, and you're shooting the third, is that right?
Yes, well, we're making the
third. They're making the third, yeah. Of course you're making the third. But Magnus has obviously been involved in lots of other really, I think, genre-redefining shows in the documentary space, as well as lots of single-camera films. So the family at his previous company, One Born Every Minute. So, I think across these four speakers, hopefully we've got quite a range of views. I think probably the best way to start off is just talking about one of the big developments of the last 2 or 3 years, really, which is the Riggs show. It's become a kind of fixture of British television. As far as I know, it hasn't really become a fixture of television in other parts of the world. It really hasn't caught on to quite the same degree. And I wonder whether it's partly because on Channel 4, the opportunity and the space left by the end of Big Brother kind of created this perfect moment. We can talk about that in a minute for Riggs shows. But perhaps just to start off with a very, very short clip, which I think shows how Riggs shows can afford you the most incredible coverage of real-life events and deliver a kind of truth that I think most documentary makers are really looking for. So, a pretty good scene, but quite familiar territory in a way. A hospital, an emergency room.
Yeah, actually, in some ways, I think that clip was probably one of the more familiar in terms of actually the nurse you heard speaking is talking specifically about the kind of medical situation, whereas I think actually a lot of what A&E does, as well as those dramatic moments, I think also touches part of people's lives that are actually nothing to do with what you're watching in front of you at that moment. And I think that that's actually what makes it really compelling. I mean, I think a lot of the most compelling moments of A&E are the really sort of quiet, quite poignant, emotional scenes that you get, perhaps between a husband and wife. And actually, what you see in that moment is something that extends so far beyond the immediate scene. And I think I think that's what makes it captivating.
Mark Raphael, in a session this morning about educating ethics, was talking about a piece of footage. There was a really great scene, a really intimate little moment, like the kind of moment you're talking about that you might miss. And I think it said something like, you can't get that unless you're doing it on a rig. And do you think that's always true? Do you think that's true, Emma? I mean, people were making films, really good films with really great actuality, really fantastic moments in them before they had 65 cameras to play with.
Of course, but I think quite an elegant example, and we were talking about it last night, if you don't mind me, you probably don't remember.
I don't remember
that. Okay, whatever. We did talk about it, was if you watch One Born and Midwives. So they...
Oh yeah, that was you, wasn't it?
that
was you
was
wanting to have a go at me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, wait, that wasn't having a go at you. I was just telling you. Anyway, so they're both really great pieces of work. Both, loved by, the Midwives did well, and obviously One Born does really well. And I found it really interesting, really powerful, really good storytelling in Midwives, but there's just those bits are slightly missing in it. And sure, the storytelling is strong, but it really kind of showed to me what a rig offers you. But obviously there's space for both, but it does pick up those moments that you're not going to get if there's somebody in the room holding a camera.
Andy, you were actually working at Channel 4 at the height of Big Brother's fame or infamy, I suppose. And do you think anybody there, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, realised that perhaps within Big Brother somewhere there was the kind of seeds of a whole nother kind of reinvention of the documentary genre?
Mags and Simon did, and Nick, obviously, and good on them for starting the ball rolling. I think the two key attributes of it are, one, it's unobtrusive, and people forget that the cameras are there in a way that PSC filming you can achieve that, but it comes with time, and so front loading the production with rigged cameras does give you unobtrusive, the ability to be unobtrusive all the time, and the other thing is that you're often, I think you deal in detail at a much greater level when you've got a rig. You often play things in real time because you're cutting from many different angles of it, and you can play something that wouldn't perhaps hold on one shot on a PSC for much longer. So in a classroom, the fact that one girl sits at the back and says, "What is pie?" and starts musing about what is pie, I don't really understand it. Probably wouldn't be caught on a single camera, and because she's on the end of a lens and there's lots of other things going on and she's musing, you can hold on it for an awful long time in real time, and it's very, very powerful. That detail is very, very, very powerful. So I think those are the two things for me that it gives and has given us in the last few years that the genre didn't have.
When everybody was talking, obviously Big Brother is slightly old news now, but when Big Brother first came out and everyone was talking about it and what it was going to do to TV and what it was going to do to factual or entertainment or whatever, did any of you see the potential then in kind of big multi-camera coverage of events? For example, did you think Big Brother is a sort of a documentary in a weird kind of a way? It's a representation of the experience of a group of people.
I mean, I think you can look at these things in hindsight slightly more easily, but for sure there were certain moments, and I think that Nick, who runs Run the Garden with, has sort of pointed this out before, but there were moments within Big Brother where it became more than the game, if you see what I mean. And I think one was the sort of nasty Nick showdown encounter. It broke out of that entertainment genre, and for that moment you were observing a scene of a group of people around a table where there was a very difficult dynamic playing out. And I suppose, again, in hindsight, you could say, well, look, that showed the potential of being able to apply that same technology, but in a real documentary space that hasn't been constructed.
It took a while though, and it took the death of Big Brother on Channel 4 in order to make the space and the money available for that to happen, didn't it?
No.
Right. So what was the crossover? When did
Well,
this...
I mean, very, very briefly, we did at Firefly, we did a series called Going Cold Turkey, where we sort of used similar technology to observe the kind of the week, a set of people going through detox. It was at lunch with Simon, a mackerel lunch with Simon Dixon, that we wondered whether we might be able to apply this into a sort of a classic documentary space, and that's what gave birth to The Family. But that was definitely pre the end of Big Brother, and actually I think what it came out of was a sense that Channel 4 at that point wanted to do something really big, and they sort of didn't care how much it was going to cost. And actually so it felt like quite an exciting moment to create something new.
Do you miss the director's voice? I mean, I think the rig shows have a director's voice, and that you know, David Clues won the BAFTA for directing on Educating Essex, but it's not the conventional kind of auteur voice. You don't hear them asking questions. You're aware that they're not in the room, Bryan. Do you miss that as a viewer or as a producer?
I don't think you miss it in the sense that the rig show is a particular type of vehicle, and it gives you a certain type of coverage. And I don't sit watching 24 Hours on A&E or One Born or whatever thinking, well, I wish I could hear an authorial voice here. You know, clearly there's an authorial guidance to what's going on. I think the rig works wonderfully well when you've got intensely dramatic situations like maternity units and like A&Es. The fact, you know, you could say that if you can't make great drama out of that, then, you know, you're not a very good filmmaker, because it's incredible. What's happening is very intense. Lives are on the line. You couldn't really do that with a crew, because they'd get in the way. You know, you can't endanger people's lives by sort of having a crew in their way as nurses and doctors are running around. I mean, I think Educating Essex, in a way, is in some ways is a sort of more impressive piece of filmmaking. Sorry, in the sense
Sorry, I'll get over it.
In the sense that, you know, with 24 Hours on A&E, there's shed loads of drama happening there, and you've just got to get it right. With Educating Essex, to me, it looks like there's far more construction over a long period of drawing out of presumably thousands and thousands of hours of footage, the little elements that you put together into a drama.
It's definitely crafted in the edit, yeah.
It's interesting, because I totally agree with you about the sort of narrative construction, and that being much more of a challenge with Educating Essex than with 24 Hours and A&E. But it is interesting, because I really believe that what people find compelling, or as compelling in A&E, is, as I said, are those quieter, very human moments that aren't I think if it was just constructed on the drama, I don't think it would be. I don't think viewers would come to it in the same way.
Well, in fact, I was going to say, I love the show, and I've watched loads of episodes of it, and I think the irony of it, in a way, is that you're using the latest, very expensive technology, and we'll come to that a bit later, to capture these moments, and then often the pace and the styling of the show, A&E, actually, as opposed to Educating Essex, is quite classic. I mean, it's not slow, but it definitely takes its time, and you know, in a way that perhaps a documentary, a single camera documentary, if you showed a commissioning editor that cut,
it's true, yeah.
They'd say, well, that's what we were doing 20 years ago. Whereas weirdly, a rig show creates a program that feels more classic.
Definitely, it plays out at a slower pace for sure, and in a funny sort of way, there was, I think, there's probably some anxiety about whether actually it was too slow, particularly initially. But it's quite interesting that actually audiences don't, there's a kind of misconception that everything needs to be unbelievably fast-paced in order for audiences not to turn over. Yeah. But I think it's kind of bucked that.
They're juggernauts, though, aren't they, these programmes? I mean, they're very, very expensive to make. You talked about Channel 4 not really caring how much they cost. I'm sure they do care.
They do now.
They do now.
I'm just saying but
they're still very, very expensive. And do you think, Emma, there's an opportunity cost to the industry in a way. If a series is commissioned and it's 14 parts, that's 14 hours that are not available to other types of programs, and they have to be 14 in order to make the scale work. I mean, does that bother you?
Because I just don't see that happening. Actually, it's not. You know, Big Brother has freed up so much. So, you know, I can commission loads of singles, loads of little series, trying stuff at 10 o'clock. It's just not eating into other parts at all. It's fine. It coexists very happily.
It definitely does feel like there is an appetite for longer runs generally. I mean, I think that Charlotte and you know, if you look at sort of BBC Two now, I mean, you get runs of 6, 8 parts even, which you wouldn't have seen a couple of years ago. Not many, no. But I think there's an increasing appetite for longer runs of documentaries across the board. I think, even on channels that don't have rig shows. Yeah.
The other, the next development I'd like to just have a quick chat about is the use of UGC, user-generated content, and that's been creeping into a lot of television programs in the last couple of years, partly as a function of the improvements in technology and the fact that people can shoot on GoPros or on phones or whatever. And this is the BBC, I've just finished working in commissioning for the BBC, and we've talked about rigs a lot and come to the conclusion that by and large, they're not easy for the BBC to do because they're very, very expensive. And you have to do a lot of them in order to make the money work, B, and C, Channel 4 already doing them really brilliantly. So they've kind of tended to seize on UGC. So there's been a few things like Britain in a Day, there's a few projects, and I think probably the most successful one so far has been Our War 2. The reason I chose that clip was really because I thought in lots of ways it's a bit like a rig show. I mean, whether they've borrowed or copied your technique of having the testimonials, you know, done after the fact, telling the story in the past tense and all that kind of stuff. And what they've rigged is a precinct with no walls, haven't they? I mean, it's not, although it's considered to be a different type of documentary, in lots of ways it's quite similar to A&E and Educating Essex, don't you think?
I suppose the one thing that is it has, in the same way that you might say rig shows at their best, there's kind of an unself-consciousness about them, in that you're not aware of the cameras, and they can feel, you can be observing something and it can feel really kind of visceral, not very sort of set up. And I suppose that feels very much like that as well. I mean, that feels, it's unmediated. It feels very unmediated, very unproduced. And I think rig shows at their best can feel like that. You can get moments that just play out, and that plays out in that way as well.
What do you think that all these commissions of all the different programs that we're talking about and are going to talk about, what do you think they're all trying to do? Is it kind of just capture realness and reality in as sort of acute a way as possible, do you think, Emma?
I think so. I mean, I thought, I watched that the other night, I thought it was absolutely fucking amazing. I was really blown away by it. And actually, just the fact that it's on his head and he's getting shot at, and you see how he's making the decisions of where he's going to go, and it's just, I don't know what it's like to be a soldier, and that showed me more than any other experience. However, I think UGC is really, really flawed. It works there, it works with the Concordia going down. It ain't going to work with me noodling around in my life because it's boring. Do you know what I mean? It's just not giving you... So it only gives you an amazing experience when there's something unbelievable going on, and then it has great value. But I think it's... Anyway, and I can't remember what your question was now. Sorry, I was just thinking about that. What was he saying? Sorry.
I was going to say...
What were you going to say? I got whipped up in that because I really like it.
I was going to say the same thing, because when you talk about user-generated, there's different ways. I mean, that just happens to be soldiers who, I'm assuming, are wearing cameras anyway. They're not putting... No. It's not like John's gone, today we're going to make our own film about what it's like to be a soldier. Whereas obviously some UGC can be much more like, here, put the filmmaking in the hands of the punters.
Like Britain in a Day did, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that they are, as Emma says, they're quite different sorts of things.
I don't know, actually, because I think that's obviously the second series of Our War. The first series of Our War was built on found footage. I mean, it was built on boxes and boxes and boxes of tapes that were in people's attics. Yeah. It was almost an archive show in a funny kind of a way. I think the second series, on the back of the first series, I don't know the answer. I don't know whether they actually sort of semi-commissioned soldiers to wear cameras or not. I mean, the feel is the same, but whether the origin is the same, I don't know.
You can see why the documentary genre has followed that, though, because we've become so used to viewing first-hand material, UGC, through the internet now, that the documentary genre had to follow and capture that immediacy that people were getting, UGC content from protesters, from the police, and it was being uploaded and people were getting, in order for television to stay relevant, it's natural, I think, that we find ways of capturing that and using it as the USP for a factual series.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen Our War, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I remember I haven't seen the second series, I haven't caught up with it yet, but the first series I thought was fantastic, and it was it's interesting you say it's sort of unmediated, but I would say it's highly mediated because they've got that one, thinking of the first episode where the guy gets killed, the amount of footage in it is actually, there's not that much. There's a huge amount of storytelling around that.
That's
brilliant
I
graphics.
suppose I didn't mean the film as a whole. I mean, the film as a whole absolutely was, as you said, was very carefully
and the way they
and
combined
the
the user-generated footage and the interviews and the graphics as well. Those great 3D graphics showing where the Taliban were coming in and how they were coming this way and they were coming that way, which just kind of brought it all to life and brought this very confused picture, which is what you get from a headcam, actually made it watchable in a way that, an awful lot of stuff that is on YouTube isn't really watchable for more than about 30 seconds.
Do you think, Emma, that the experiments or the conversations that are being had around UGC, do you think that's going to turn into as seismic a thing in documentaries as rigs have in this country?
I'd be surprised if I think maybe somebody will crack it, but I think
it's already happened once with Video Nation 10, 15 years ago, hasn't it? It had a big effect then.
I just, Britain in a Days, it's nice, but it's not, I don't remember much. Do you know what I mean, though? It's like, it's an interesting experiment in what you can do, but I don't think I'm going to start putting on my telly at 9 o'clock and watching, unless it's about something really amazing. I mean, I think Charlotte's doing it with, like, is it people knocking people off bikes?
How are you shooting your NHS series?
What's that?
How are you shooting your NHS series?
That's crews. There'll be.
Can you tell us about? Because there'll be people who don't know what the series is about. Are you allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, I think so.
That's another big attempt to do something really big with documentaries, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is a series in which we are. It's an 8-part series that we're filming across the NHS in a single day. So. Everything is about that day. So it's a way of cutting through the NHS. And so we're sort of dispatching, I think it's something like 65 camera sort of teams.
70.
70.
I heard 70, but yeah.
80.
A lot, anyway.
95 maybe. Yeah. Anyway, so it's a kind of it's another way of looking at this institution that touches all our lives. But we'll be going all over the place, and not just into the familiar hospital spaces, but wherever the NHS touches Britain in a way.
I think where user-generated content really works well is where it's capturing something extraordinary and dramatic that you couldn't get a filmmaker to go and do. Because actually filmmakers on the whole are much better at making films than people who haven't done it before. Yeah. And so they bring a lot of skills to bear on
those
that.
The soldiers in our war are not filmmakers, they're
but they're in an
picture
incredibly dramatic an unrepeatable situation.
Totally, yeah. And I think that's where it really, really does work. Yeah. Where it's not, you can't replace that with a cameraman.
No. But it will be interesting because there's the level of intimacy you get with some of that material. And I think if we get to a point where people become less self-conscious and it might throw up yet another kind of evolution of how we kind of tell stories, possibly. But I think it's going to take quite a lot of experimentation to kind of get to that space. Okay.
I mean, both the shows we've seen so far are kind of masterpieces, I think, of edit producing. They're made. They're not saved in the edit. They're created in the edit, and so they're as I say, they're a brilliant example of fantastic edit producing. But do we still need directors, Brian?
Absolutely, because the directors are so often are creating the situations, they're moulding the situations, they're drawing out. You can, in observational documentary, you're choosing where to focus, and you're also asking people questions and teasing things out that they wouldn't.
So that's the
that
flip
they're not
side. Because one of you said, the thing about the crew or director is they'll just get in the way, but in actual fact, the flip side of that is getting in the way. Will often, but that will often create moments that wouldn't happen otherwise.
I think you just find, obviously you need to interrogate the material, but there are different ways of doing that. You can either do it on location as a director in what you choose to point the camera at, what you choose to ask people, but you can obviously also do that after the fact with interviews. You can clearly editorialise something, but in different ways.
It's probably a tiny point, but on A&E and Educating Essex, we were talking about the voice earlier, but they are both literally voiced by the directors, David Clues and Lanty Phillipson, and I wonder if that is maybe a subconscious decision that, this is a director saying, we didn't just fucking put the cameras here, this is my version of what happened.
Yeah. I never thought of that, but you're right. It is, and it is. So in that sense, it is literally their voice. The next clip I want to show is really just picking up on what Bryan was saying about directors. Thank God we do still need directors, and they do still create moments in films. I'm just going to show a little clip of a film that Bryan's been working on recently, which has got the working title of Old and Poor. It hasn't been on yet, and it's just from. It's not been online or anything, but it's just a little moment. I thought it was rather a sweet moment that we might lead us into talking about. The kind of situations that a director can cover but also kind of help create. So I love that clip, and I love the fact that it's a conversation, and I think one of the things that I sometimes wish or sometimes miss from rig shows and UGC shows is, unless a conversation naturally occurred that's a great moment that you want to put in your film, sometimes you wish there are conversations that you wish would have happened, and if the director was on sort of on the floor, as it were, or in the room, they could have actually initiated that, and that you would have got to a moment like that, which I think is a great moment that you wouldn't get with a rig show.
I don't know, because most rig shows have as their narrative spine an interview, a set piece interview, and there is a conversation in that. My favourite bit of Educating Essex is where there's a young lad called Ryan who's got Asperger's, and he's wondering whether to go to the prom, and David, the director, asks him a question, and there's another producer, Grace, is in there as well, and he turns around and he goes, should I go to the prom, should I go with Grace, what do you think? And it becomes a conversation, and the interviews are, by their very virtue, one half of the conversation. That's what we do, isn't it? We stimulate conversation by asking people questions.
But that part of it isn't rig show, though. That part of it's traditional documentary making.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I don't think rig show is that much of a step on from narratively or structurally from observational filming. I think it's about you're reaping your rushes a different way. I don't think the process afterwards.
What about casting? I mean, she's a lovely old lady, that lady, and cast in a kind of traditional way. Again, some of these other shows, the other approach is casting's slightly different, isn't it? I mean, you'll cast your main. You've got your main characters, but then you have a kind of a huge amount of people passing through this machine that you've created. And are those people then ultimately kind of cast in the edit almost? Because you at the point of shooting, you're just covering it.
Yeah, fundamentally. But what's really interesting is because of course, with A&E, you are limiting your choices because you're taking a 24-hour period for starts, and you are just faced with whoever comes through the door and whoever consents to being filmed. So, but what's really interesting, I think, is how compelling those lives are that you observe. We tend to think in TV, they're not very good characters. They're a good character, not good TV. There's always all those kind of conversations go on in pre-production endlessly about sort of casting, and but it is interesting that actually you can find something about such a multitude of setups and scenarios that is really fascinating and compelling. So
I'm just intrigued about that, because 24 hours in A&E, why 24 hours in A&E? Why not 3 days in A&E, or a week in A&E, or why not just A&E, and you just take the best stories? Why did you choose that particular restriction that all of this hour has to be one 24-hour period?
It's a good question. We debated it a lot, even in the first series. I think sometimes the restrictions you put upon yourself as a filmmaker are a good thing anyway, because had we sat there and filmed over a period of weeks and just, cut together the best stuff. I think, first of all, the sort of editorialising that would have gone on in that process, let's cut this story next to that story, let's cut this. I think the very fact of it happening on a day, I think, means something to the audience. I think they feel all of these different aspects of life came through this department in the same day. Had we just kind of had carte blanche to put whatever story, I think the hand of the producer would have felt much more across the series in a way that I think would have made it a less interesting experience to view.
But that's what happened with Educating Essex, presumably. You're not saying each episode is 24 hours in a day. It's not a school day,
no,
is it?
we themed it. No, absolutely. Each episode had a theme. I think
there is, but there's the good reason for that distinction is in A&E, people do come in and out within a day.
Randomly, basically.
Randomly, in a day. They're in and out in a day.
What you mean? Most people are only there for a day.
Well, at the very most. I mean, people aren't, probably, if not 2 or 3 hours. So the sort of nature of that place is very high turnover.
Like Cheek by Jal Nature, I think my favourite one's, the fourth one of the first series, where the guy who wrote Telstar, the very posh white guy, is
That's
surrounded by
third episode.
black on black crime.
Yeah.
It's the real picture of South London. It's brilliant.
I mean, obviously, one of the difficult things for a PSC director, like, it's fine when you're filming one person showing you their knickers in a cupboard and having a little chat with them in their bedroom. There are, I think, until some of these other techniques came about, I think there were some subjects that for documentary makers were almost too big to cover, weren't they? Except unless you could break it down into really, really small little pieces, personal pieces. And I think one of the great things about Educating Essex, actually, is that it's shown how the multi-camera approach is great for covering really, really complex scenes. I mean, really complex scenes where lots of stuff's going on. And I'm actually going to show, as chance would have it, the clip where she's wondering about pie. I've spoiled it now. But anyway, let's have a look at the clip and then we can talk about that.
You see, I would take issue with the fact that you can only get that with a rig. If I'd known you were going to show that, I would have brought along a clip from a film we made called The Nurture Room for More 4, which was 100 minutes, no comm, no interviews. It was just observing life in 3 Glasgow primary schools over a year. And that was all single camera. It was just Matt Pinder shot it and directed it, and occasionally had someone with him doing sound, but usually didn't. He's usually on his own. And he just built up relationships with the teachers and the pupils. I remember when I first went up to Glasgow, and it's taken us about a year to get access to these primary schools, because they were particularly troubled, primary schools where they had lots of violent kids. And the first time after Matt had started shooting, about 2 weeks in, I went up to see the head teachers, and they said, "Oh, we love Matt. He's wonderful. He just disappears into the wallpaper. He's wonderful." And that was the point, and that's what he did. And there are scenes in The Nurture Room that are similar. There's one scene where a little boy is just confused about how to do his letters. He's got to fill in the letters in a snake. And the kid's got a radio mic on, but it's completely oblivious to the fact that he's got a radio mic on, completely oblivious to the fact that Matt's on the other side of the room focused on him. And he's asking the teacher how to do it, and the teacher is hassled and, gives him a little bit of attention, and then walks away, and he just kind of slams his pencil down and says, "You should be teaching me. You should be showing me how to do it." And he's really frustrated and completely unaware of a camera there. So I think you can get that kind of intimacy.
So do you think Channel 4 should just save huge amounts of money and just
No,
hire
hold
Matt
on a
Pinder
minute,
to
though.
make Educating Essex?
You can capture it, right? But the way it's packaged and the way the story is told with Rick, it's sort of going beyond documentary. It's attracting the sort of people that might sit and watch Coronation Street. It's really, and I'm not saying other documentaries haven't done that. I just think it's really interesting that 4 million people will sit and watch One Born and A&E. They're sort of taking it to their hearts in a way that they would watch Coronation Street on ITV. And I think that's...
And do you think that's because they're actually appreciating the production values without realising it, and they like the coverage without realising it, and they appreciate the fact you've got every single shot.
It did always feel, when we first did The Family, it always felt a bit more, the grammar of it always felt a bit more akin to drama, and I think that audiences, they read that into it. And I think they feel, so they immerse themselves in that storytelling in the way that they might immerse themselves in a drama. There's something quite accessible about it.
I agree with that. I think the most powerful illustrations of the rig on educating essays are where you're in two places at once. When you know something's going on in a classroom and the headmaster's been called, and you can cut to the headmaster's office as he's told information you already know, and then you watch him walk and you can get that feeling of going, oh fuck, the headmaster's coming. You know, that's the power of it, having 60 cameras to be able to go, I'm going there and there at the same time is...
It's interesting, 60 cameras and 70 cameras for the NHS thing. Is that about the amount of cameras you think you need now to make a contemporary looking show?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's funny that we keep coming back to this idea of lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of cameras. I mean, there are obviously real advantages in terms of the look and feel of the material you can get.
But you're 70 cameras
No,
for
that's
NHS in a day all over the country,
Yeah, they're
aren't they?
single cameras, and it's a different...
But it's not
I mean,
sustainable.
it's the coincidence that there are a similar number of cameras. It's not... I don't think that's not a relevant connection. I think obviously the amount of cameras you have in a rig situation, as Andy said, it does mean that you can catch simultaneous action, and that creates a dynamic that is interesting in itself.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, we're doing a couple of shows with smaller.
Tell us about the thing you're doing for ITV2 briefly.
We're doing something set in a hotel in Magaluf, a resort, and where young kids go to have summer fun. And that's 25 cameras. But it's only a proportion of that show is rigged. You know, it involves constructed reality as well. And then we're doing something with a very small rig, which has got 8 cameras, which is a fact-tent format for Discovery, which we can literally just pop into a house.
So there's more coming.
Yeah, and we're talking to Mark at Channel 4 about another one that involves just it's much smaller in the domestic.
Well, there's still so-called conventional films being made and series being made. The old-fashioned documentaries by named directors. The next clip is a very short clip from Claridge's, which is something that Magnus's company are also working on.
It's not. I think the clip is. It's an offline cut, so it's not even the final cut.
No, it's absolutely not. It's a work in progress.
It's almost sort of not quite rushes, but
yeah. Well, let's just have a quick look at it. So as far as I know, that's all shot single camera, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think that sequence or other sequences? I haven't seen the whole series yet, but do you think it's been influenced by rig shows in terms of that kind of mix of scale, the idea of being in 5 different places at once, and detail? So the kind of straightening of one fork. Plus.
Yes. No. I think they're...
That's okay. You don't have to say yes.
Although actually that was cut, interestingly, that was cut by Sam Santana, who has... He has worked on the rig show. So I suppose I'll have to accept there's a possibility that he may have been influenced in the way he cut that sequence. I think what that was about is, and I can see what you mean about the kind of, you're seeing the same event from a multitude of perspectives. It is single camera. I'm not sure whether on that day they might have had 2 cameras. But because it's Claridge's, it's sort of all about the sort of slightly obsessional details about getting things just right. So I think the details is partly about expressing the sort of mindset of the hotel.
When you were discussing that with the BBC, did the word rig ever come up? I mean, was it ever a possibility that you might do that as a rig?
No.
Because they didn't want to do a rig, or because Claridge's wouldn't let that amount of stuff come into the building?
I'm sure both, but it wouldn't. It was never. There was never a question that would be a rig show. I mean, I'm sure there's no way that Claridge's would have let us rig the hotel anyway. But I also think that it seems quite clear that certainly at the moment, that the BBC aren't interested in going, the rig show direction.
Didn't it come from the antithesis of the rig in a way, from an authored filmmaker? It was Jane's, wasn't it? Jane's.
Yes, yeah, it was Jane's. So it's Jane Treyer's access to Claridge's. Yeah.
So you can't really. I think that's the other end of the
spectrum. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm just conscious that we've got about 10 minutes. And I wondered whether, I mean, I have another clip which we could show, or we could go to questions now. So I wondered if anybody had any questions. And if not, I've got my fallback position. Any questions? Any questions? There's one up the back there. Can you wait until the microphone comes to you?
Hi, you touched on it just briefly about how the YouTube generation and people generating their own content has made people more relaxed about seeing first-person perspective and so on. Is it also, recently, we've seen more of a skew for female audiences to take in shows such as you've been talking about. Is that been a conscious decision to try and do it yourselves, or is that been a case of the tail wagging the dog? Or is it have those female audiences sort of jumped in and feel more relaxed about watching these kind of shows, or is it something you're consciously trying to develop?
Are you asking Emma,
Well, just,
or?
yeah, yes, well, just generally, yes, because it's as a general situation.
Sorry, just say that again.
Recap. I mean, from what we've seen, it's that female audiences are beginning to latch on more to the documentary intake because of shows like you've been discussing. And is that a conscious effort, or is that just something that's just kind of happened?
I don't think so. I think there is data around that says more women watch documentaries just naturally as a fallback, but I don't think so. I think men are attracted to them as well. I don't think we choose it to go to certain spaces just because they'll appeal to women. No, not really.
I mean, you're presumably all you're ever trying to do at Channel 4 or any other channel is just get as big as audience as possible and appeal to as many people as possible.
No, it's not like that at all.
No? Not at all? That just doesn't come up?
No, never.
Do you think, I'm not really one for quotes, but here goes anyway, Grierson once said that the documentary, his definition of it was the creative treatment of actuality. I mean, is that, most of the things we've seen today, John Grierson probably wouldn't, he probably wouldn't understand their accents for a start, but he wouldn't recognise the grammar of it, and yet, really, all we're really talking about is people still not resting on their laurels and digging deep and trying to find new ways of telling factual stories and capturing reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly exciting. All you ever want is people kind of coming to your door and either desperate to kind of, in a kind of a Bryan way of to have their take on the world, ask those questions, or trying to evolve the format a bit. I mean, it's incredibly exciting. It's an amazing time for documentaries. So all of this, it should be celebrated, and we should just be encouraging it. So Riggs is still a giant, and something else comes up, and all the other films still, and it just seems to me that there's much more kind of possibility and kind of money and excitement around it all. So it's all good, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that rig shows, the rig shows that are successful, like A&E and One Born and Educating Essex, are successful not because they're rig shows, but because they're great storytelling with characters you care about, and you want to know what happens to them and all those things, which is exactly the same as a single camera made film, a PSE film. It's all about just good storytelling and good character and drama.
Although you do hear anecdotally, I mean, I know people who've worked on lots of these big, almost machine shows with huge amounts of people involved. I think sometimes what gets you into the business as a documentary maker, as a filmmaker in the first place, is often, ambition and ego. And your ego, not your ambition necessarily, but your ego has to be quite subsumed to the sort of bigger task, doesn't it? I mean, if you're working on one of these shows, unless you're the absolute boss, you are a bit of a cog, aren't you, in the machine?
But I think even if you're the absolute boss, that they are interesting enterprises because that you're so reliant upon the good judgment of so many people. That is quite different. I mean, you can't control it in the same way that you can control it as a director if you're directing a single camera show, where basically you tend to be in every scene. You see what I mean? You tend to be present for every scene that you film.
Could you do that, Bryan, do you think? Would you like to do it?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a fascinating challenge. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to just keep making the same type of film the same kind of way. Of course, that gets dull. You want to. But
I think one of the challenges is that because rig shows are so expensive and so massive to mount, isn't there a danger that the people who make them will carry on making them, and it will be
Yeah,
hard
of
for other
course,
people
of
to get
course. I
involved?
mean, it would be very hard for me to go into Channel 4 and convince them that we should make a rig show, because they go, well, you know, you do that, and you do that thing over there, and you're in that box, and you know, how dare you get out of your box? And there's always a degree of that, you know. We're all, and as we were talking about just before, you know, being typecast is a huge advantage because it means you get work, but it's a huge disadvantage because you keep getting asked to do the same kind of work.
So how will you, Andrew, how will you avoid being typecast as simply the company that makes rig shows by not just doing them?
Yeah, we've got a vast factual portfolio, and only 3 of our shows are rig shows. So I don't think, it's funny when you see our company name at the moment, they say the Educating Essex Indie, and it's nice having a big show that people like. Long may it continue, and we have lots of others, but I don't think we are typecast as a rigged show. I think it's probably more of a question for Mags, because they do more of it.
Yeah, although not. Actually, because I think, I'll probably get this wrong, but I think actually 24 Hours in A&E is the only rig show we're currently doing. So, I mean, although it's a big one, obviously, and there's loads and loads of different types of things that we are doing. So I'm not fearful of that. And I think in some ways, you know, just hearing Andy about talking about how they're sort of adapting it and using smaller rigs and using it for part, I think that's all interesting, and that should all be encouraged, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? You want to try and keep finding new ways of getting at familiar stories, I think.
Do you think, Emma, do you think that, what do you think we would be sitting on here on stage talking about in terms of developments in documentary if it hadn't been for multi-camera coming along? Because I remember about 3 or 4 years ago it feeling like something did need to happen around documentaries and single camera. There was a rich tradition, there were loads of really great filmmakers and some fantastic films, but it was really stuck in a rut until about 4 years ago. Yeah. I mean, did this have to happen in order for the whole form to stay relevant? Yeah,
I think it did, and I think that's why we're all feeling sort of wonderfully invigorated, and that can sort of live as its own kind of genre now. And I think maybe the time has come again for something exciting to happen. And you know, maybe there is something at kind of looking at the sophisticated ways that we kind of, you know, look at YouTube, all this unbelievable amounts of information and entertainment we have all the time. You know, I guess we are all thinking, how does kind of television reflect some of that? And is it possible to get a level of coherence with that? And, you know, as I say, it's kind of exciting times. The world's moving very fast. And it kind of feels that we've been given a massive injection of kind of, you know, goodwill, viewers, everything, because of, you know, what all these guys do. But one thing I would like to just say, and it's a bit, I just think for younger people, like you're saying, like these huge kind of crews and lots of cogs and wheels. What I think is important for somebody to become David and Anthony is that to be able to still come out and not just work on rig shows. I just think is really important, because we don't want to kind of end up. You know, David made a lot of brilliant single films before he became, you know, Essex. So I just think it's really important to have a mix.
I think that what you would hope, though, is that I think they are also, if you've got very big production teams, it's a brilliant opportunity for lots of people. But, of course, then they also need another opportunity, which is to then go and direct single films, and then perhaps bring that expertise back.
Exactly, yeah.
I think what they offer is, you know, they're a gift for a broadcaster, because you hear commissioners all the time say, what a big idea, what a big idea. You know, they are literally big ideas. You can put them on a poster. You can order them in 14 parts. That's a gift for a broadcaster, and that's why I think there will be a continued fascination with them. I think that's why they're being recommissioned.
Okay. Well, I think we're almost out of time. We've got 2 minutes.
Go on, show the last clip.
Yeah, I have got a last clip to say. Yeah, which is really just to say that you know, I think in the end, what we're all talking about is all the different ways and all the clever ways that clever and talented directors or producers can kind of capture moments. And I think, you know, lest we forget, it all started with the kind of documentaries we've spent half the time talking about started in the early 60s with small cameras that could go to places that they'd never been before and capture sort of a kind of reality that we've all kind of grown used to and almost a bit blasé about. I just thought it'd be nice to remember the clip from one of Bryan's films, which directed by Jezza Newman, called Poor Kids. I just think it's a really good example of, in a way, what we're all trying to get to, but whatever technique we're using. Anyway.
You cut off before the best bit, because the line after that, the little girl on the left says, no, social workers might help you out. And she says, social workers will be dead by the time I'm 21. That's the best line at the end. But what I love about that clip, though, is that, obviously Jezza was there in the room, and obviously they'd been playing on the bed for a while, and they'd calmed down a bit, and he'd then just put in a couple of odd questions, and he'd just guided that conversation. They wouldn't have naturally had that conversation, but you don't hear his voice, you don't hear him asking questions. It's just a beautiful bit of constructing what sort of looks like a conversation, but obviously, if you think about it, isn't. It's an interview, but it feels like it's an observed conversation between two little girls.
Brilliant. I think on that note, we've got to finish on time. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.